Go.
Welcome everybody to today's discussion about Wales and the Senedd elections that were last week. Probably a good starting place before we get stuck in is to just go around and introduce ourselves. So I'll start with me. I am Louise Whatham from the PRCA.
And I'm Tomos, the UK Commercial Manager at GovConnex.
Rhys Flowers, Director of Communications for Wales for Cymru, part of the wider For agency.
Hi, and I am Craig Lawton, Associate Director and Head of Corporate Affairs at Grasshopper Communications. Thank you very much for the invitation to the PRCA as well.
Thanks for coming along. Last Thursday, Welsh elections. Welsh people headed for the polls to decide on the Senedd elections, which no doubt created a systemic change for Wales, just so dramatic. And I think in Westminster, those of us kind of outside of Welsh politics, someone had told us last week that the Welsh valleys would become the political hotbed for the main political parties, I think we would have laughed. So what we've seen play out is probably the most dramatic changes that we've seen for many, many years. I was at a talk yesterday with Sir John Curtis, and he was showing some slides on voter data for Wales. And it showed that 2026 was the lowest Labour score since 1906 and the lowest Conservative share of the vote since 1916. So it's just absolutely epic. I can't kind of emphasise how dramatic that was. So just here today to talk about that, and as the dust settles on that, and just to talk about why it's important and why it matters. So maybe if we could start with that, really. Craig, if you want to pick up on that a little bit, why it's important and what kind of happened last week.
Well, I think we've seen a huge change in the map for Wales last week, not only in the electoral system, but in the outcome as well. We've gone from 60 members of the Senedd to 96, a significant increase. And in that, we've also seen a change in the voting system. And at the same time, even more change, as you've alluded to, Louise, we've seen a huge change in the representatives in the Senedd. We now have 43 Plaid Cymru MSs. Hotly pursued, I must say, with 34 is Reform, 9 Labour, just 9, down from the 50% of seats they had at the last Senedd, just 9 seats now in a 96-seat Senedd.
Crazy.
7 Conservatives, 2 Greens, the first time the Greens have been represented in the Senedd, and still 1 Liberal Democrat in the form of Jane Dodds. So a huge change there. But equally, in some ways, not a lot of change, because we still do not have a majority government. We've never had a majority government here in Wales. So there's that has not changed. I guess the big change is that for the first time ever, Wales has a Plaid Cymru First Minister, and we're starting to see some of the first things they're looking to do in terms of the cabinet they've appointed and some of their priorities. So a lot of change, but equally similarities in some ways, I would say.
And I think, just to put it in its sort of historical perspective, since the vote was widened to, the working classes, I think in 1868, only 2 political parties have ever won in Wales. The Liberals won every election from 1868 to 1922, and the Labour Party have won every election from 1922 since in Westminster and the Senedd. So I think it just goes to show how seismic that change is, that a different party such as Plaid has come in and won it, and then not only that Reform have come second as well.
And when I think the valleys in particular in northeast Wales, where the stereotype being, you put a red rosette on a donkey and it would vote Labour, what suddenly compels a voter to switch. And even if you're a non-voter, turnout in the valleys, even at general elections, is chronically quite poor. So to see it grow quite significantly sort of indicates to me that people saw this as an opportunity to break with consensus. that a critical mass had been reached, that, even the non-voter goes, oh, well, actually, this may be the first time ever where if I vote, something will change. And that change narrative, I think, was something you saw heavily from both Plaid and from Reform UK as well. Now, the question is do those voter coalitions entrench? Do we see a sort of Scotland SNP-like cementing of that left-wing vote in terms of Plaid? But as well, do we see that cementing as Reform as the main right-wing opposition? And now these seats go from comfortable, safe seats where, quite famously, London's Labour Party would choose more favourable candidates to represent Merthyr Tydfil, who may not necessarily have been from the Gurnus estate, but instead, they are now much more hotly contested as electoral battlegrounds. And what I'm perhaps interested, Craig and Rhys, you might have a thought where it's, if you were a Labour voter that went Plaid, would you be willing to go back? But if you were a Labour voter that went Reform, you've crossed the floor. And same if you were, say, a Conservative voter that went Reform, would you be able to come back? But if you're a Conservative voter that went Plaid, that's it, you've crossed the floor now, and it's sort of entrenched there. So it's interesting to see where those coalitions are going to cement electorally going forward.
I would say that we're experiencing a situation in politics where everything is to play for every election. I think things have never been so fluid. You only have to go on social media at every election, whether it be council, Senedd, Westminster, to look at discussions about who should you vote for to get somebody or to get somebody out or to stop somebody. We've never seen so much fluidity, and I think that is going to be a continuation. And I think that's really interesting because we saw Rhys Iorwerth in his first speech, having been sworn in as First Minister, talk about what he was going to do and how he was going to work for everybody in Wales, no matter who you voted for. And so I think Plaid are very mindful already of the fact that they may have had people vote for them, but actually those same people might not vote for them next time, and there may be different people voting for them. So I think, we're seeing that in the narrative of Plaid, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing it in the narrative of other parties going forward. For Reform in particular, I guess for them, it's how can they go from having 0 elected MSs, no MSs in the last Senedd elected with that Reform rosette initially. How can they go from having 0 to 34? How can they now use this as a foundation to build in Wales? But let's be realistic. How can Nigel Farage use this as a springboard for Parliament? Because that's what they want to do as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of parties looking to win votes back, but also retain votes in the future in a very fluid situation.
Yeah, I think, as you both say, it's going to be really interesting where it goes from here, because it is quite clear that Plaid have benefited from an element of tactical voting from those who didn't want to see Reform come in. You have to look at constituencies such as my own, Abertawe Goir, have returned 3 Plaid members. Those constituencies in the Cardiff area, 3 Plaid. It's unprecedented. It was the same. They returned the same amount of Plaid members as some of the traditional heartlands, such as Carmarthenshire or Ceredigion Penfro, for example. But I guess the opportunity for Plaid is if they can deliver in some meaningful way, make a difference, be it in health, in education, which of course is not going to be very easy for them. Does that give them a platform to build on? In the same way, when you look at Reform as being the sort of insurgent newcomers, well, I think we remember the Senedd, the 2016-2021 Senedd, where the old UKIP, Brexit party, whatever you want to call it, completely imploded and went different ways. So I think the leader of Reform has a big challenge on his hands in terms of discipline, and it's going to be really, really interesting how serious they take opposition and how that all plays out. Because if it goes the same way as we've seen in previous sort of Senedd terms, then it could do damage for them, and who knows what the political landscape will look like in 4 years' time when the next election comes around.
I would say to that though, I've been speaking quite regularly to all the parties in the run-up to this election, and the people that are behind the scenes in Reform, they're not new to politics. Some of their candidates and some of their now MSs might be quite new, but actually the people behind the scenes running the show, they're very experienced. And a lot of them worked in that UKIP group back in 2016. So they know the dangers of what an inexperienced group can lead to. And I'm sure they're going to be working really hard to make sure that they don't have the similar situation again. The big issue for them is that they have 34 MSs, none of which are in government. So you've got a huge number of MSs with time on their hands, for want of a better term. There is a real opportunity there for organizations to engage with new MSs, especially ones that maybe are very inexperienced politically, to start to get their messages across, their asks across. But there's also a danger for reform there, because ultimately they'll have people with time on their hands to go and come up with their own ideas and do different things and explore things, which could cause them a headache. It's exactly the same for Plaid. Don't get me wrong; it's no different for them. Nobody has had a group of 43 MSs in the Senedd before. This is a massive group in many ways from a Senedd perspective. So there is opportunity, but there is risk there for those parties, I think.
Can I just jump in, because I think from my perspective, so it's a new system, a new voting system that's been used. There's been a real increase in representation. Could you go over that a little bit as well for those of us who aren't as entrenched in the logistics of that and the technicalities and what that kind of looks like?
So yeah, as you say, Louise, we have a new system and a new map for Wales. So 96 MSs across 16 constituencies. They're pretty big constituencies. The simplest way of describing them is that they've taken two Westminster constituencies, stuck them together, and then you have a super constituency. So, for example, as Rhys alluded to earlier, he is in Goya Abertawe. So that is the UK Parliament Gower seat and the UK Parliament Swansea West seat stuck together. So you have 16 of those constituencies. Each of those constituencies elects 6 members of the Senedd, all via a D'Hondt system. So the simplest way of describing that is, for anyone that's voted in the Senedd elections before, the old regional list system, the top-up list as it was called, which we still have in Scotland as well, bear in mind, that's the system that is used for every MS being elected. So it used to be you had 2 ballot papers, you had 2 votes, one for your constituency, one for your top-up. Now it's just 1 ballot paper, 1 cross next to the party you want. The party that gets the most votes gets the number 1 seat. Their vote to share is then divided. So some maths happens, essentially, is the best way of describing it. The party with the next most seats, next most votes gets the next one, and it continues on. So that's why we've seen in Gwynedd Maldwyn, for example, 4 Plaid Cymru MSs and 2 Reform MSs, because putting it simply, Plaid got approximately double the amount of votes of Reform, and many, many, many more votes than anybody else. Whereas you look at some other seats and it's much more fractured.
So does that mean that constituents have 1 representative or many?
So it now means that every constituent across Wales has 6 members of the Senedd.
Is that a little bit confusing? Like, you don't know who to go to for what, or do they have different portfolios?
I mean, arguably it's confusing in the sense that for someone that has had no involvement with politics at all, they look at it and go, which of these people can I talk to? But equally, I would say it means that you have more choice. It's no different from going onto the high street and going, which supermarket am I going to go and buy my milk from? You can go and talk to a variety of different MSs. I would genuinely say, in my experience, some considerable time ago now, when I worked at the Senedd, I worked for a regional Conservative MS. What we would have is constituents coming to us who didn't want to complain about the Labour-run local authority at the time to their Labour representative, because they felt, in their view, the Labour representative might not work very hard for them because they might not want to criticise their own administration. So they would come to us. And then vice versa, if you had somebody that was disappointed with the Conservative UK government policy, they wouldn't come to us. They would go to one of the other parties. So in a way, it gives you more choice for people to stand up for you.
I can see why there might be benefits to that, like you just said, but I can also see why that might potentially fracture politics a little bit, because you're then taking issues that are at a local level and politicising them in some way as well. But,
I suppose from my perspective, working with clients, for example, and day-to-day work, it does potentially complicate matters if you have an event or something in a particular constituency. I think previously it may be a lot more clear cut who you need to invite and so forth. And I think it might get a bit more complicated if, say, in the interest of fairness, you need to invite all 6. Are there internal politics there between, the different members and so forth? So, and also some of these constituencies that are geographically pretty big as well. So, Craig mentioned Gwynedd Maldwyn there. That's certainly a big one in terms of the mileage. If you got something going on in Penllyn and the 6, I just think it does make it a bit more less, a bit more complicated in terms of engaging with your local member. If you're an organisation and you want to get them on board, maybe more opportunity, but also sort of pitfalls as well.
There is a real opportunity for there to be real specialism now, though. I mean, you look at UK Parliament and they've got 650 approximately. I'm never sure what the number is. It always changes. 650 MPs. One less as of yesterday, with one resigning. 650. You've now got 96 members of the Senedd. Before, you had MSs sitting on 2 and 3 committees, not being able to specialise in things. And also, as you say, having to go to loads of things across constituencies. Now you will have a potential for actually those MSs to start specialising in things. So we've already heard from one of the new Reform MSs in the Penna Bont Bro Morgannwg seat that they have real experience of the care system and mental health and wellbeing within young people. That's going to be a real focus for them. And so I would argue if there's a charity or an organisation working in that sector, maybe go to that Reform MS from that region and that constituency, and potentially not another one. So there is a real opportunity for specialism and some real time being put into things, as opposed to it all feeling a little bit rushed previously when you had 3 committees to sit on, First Minister's questions, but by the way, and a mayor's inauguration and a ribbon cutting and a dog show. It does change things.
And as well, multi-member constituencies aren't new in the UK. Council level, it's quite common to have constituencies with multiple representatives. In Westminster, there used to be multi-member constituencies. So it's not new, but it certainly opens. I think where the problem arises is when certain MSs claim they're more legitimate. Yeah. I think you saw in the last Parliament quite famously, I think it was Jane Dodds who got told off in the Senedd for saying, as the MS for Montgomeryshire, well, she was Mid and West Wales, but Montgomeryshire was within it, and it was like, no, you're for all this constituency. So when legitimacy questions and MSs try to claim they're more legitimate because I was elected as number 1, so my vote is more legitimate than you at number 6. The confusion comes there. But you see conversations happening. I saw very preliminarily where it's like, if we've got Remembrance Day services right across, these massive constituencies, let's work out a sort of bipartisan way to ensure that we're not all just going to one. We're trying to spread ourselves out and do it on a rotational basis and share the love, as it were. So there's a lot of opportunity to engage as well, because, anyone who works in Westminster lobbying, if you want to do something in one constituency, if that one MP is not interested, that's it. You're done.
I think it's quite interesting what you said about the being number 1, because they'll obviously know those, the share of the vote they got. And I know that the new system was used, the closed list, is that right?
Yes.
Is that the new system that was used? And it was the first time it was used. Do you think that the outcome is sort of it's obviously representative of that, but also tactical voting as well? I know, Rhys, you spoke a little bit about tactical voting, and I just wondered if you had views on kind of the system that was used and whether it should be used again. I don't know if that's too nerdy to go into, but I'm quite interested in systems.
Well, I'm sure Craig and Tomos can probably talk better than me on it, but I think the big question is whether the same system will end up being used in the next election. I think the consensus is, well, I think it came about as some sort of a shotgun marriage between UK Labour and Welsh Labour, something that they could just about agree on. But and I can only assume that Labour at the time thought it would benefit them, but the irony is it's actually ended up punishing them and rewarding pride and reform itself. So I don't think there's a lot of love for the present system, though. And I think it would require 2/3.
As we're at the point of recording, we are a week and a bit post election. We don't know exactly where the new MSs are going to locate their offices yet. But I think give it till the end of the summer. And if we suddenly look at, let's use the example Tomos has given there, and we see that suddenly all of those 6 MSs have their offices based in between Llandrindod and Brecon, that gives us a clear indication that actually this system isn't working. And there'll be a real kind of call on those MSs to go and work in different parts of their constituencies.
And just to underline Thomas's point, as a proud native of the Upper Swansea Valley, it blows my mind that we're in the same constituency as Brycheiniog and the wider. But to be fair, that's been brought in Westminster as well, because the Westminster has been drawn like that. But culturally, economically, everything, it's just such a bad fit. But
it was deeply flawed at its and I remember showing my hand. I went to the count for Gwynedd Maldwyn, and they had it in Carnarvon, the very top northwest. For those who are listening and trying to visualize Wales, you think of Wales as sort of a backwards sea. It's at the top of that, and then I came from Newtown, which is on the English border. So if you're thinking in your head, basically Shrewsbury to Carnarvon, how does an MS represent a seat like that? It's a 3-hour drive. You're going to have to spend time really thinking about how am I doing my constituency days? How am I? You wouldn't start the morning 9 a.m. in the east, 3-hour drive up to Carnarvon to have meetings in the afternoon. You'd have to, and I think culturally as well, Gwynedd is very different to a place like Maldwyn, and same like the Upper Swansea Valley is going to be very different to Radnor, and obviously you won't have all those cultural differences, but like Ceredigion, Sir Penfro, how is someone from Pembroke Dock going to relate all that much from someone from Aberdaron? I don't think that. Because it's getting probably very parochial for those.
I would make one point here though. I think it's just really important, and it goes back to the question that Louise asked a little bit earlier. So whether you were number 1 on the list and elected, or whether you were, as there are some cases, number 4 on the list and elected by, let's just say 5-6 votes, you all have the same standing in this Senedd. It's absolutely no different from an MP elected in Westminster with a majority of 30,000 compared to an MP elected with a majority of 27, as has happened, or less so than that. Everybody has the same amount of standing. And you could well see, and we have already seen ministers appointed to this government who are not number 1 on the list. Adam Price has been made a minister in this new Welsh government, and he is number 3 on the list in Sir Gaerfyrddon. So there is, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. Everyone has the same amount of standing. And I would say from a tactical perspective, if you want to engage with your MSs, it may well be that some people incorrectly look and go, number 3 or number 4 on the list, they have less legitimacy. Some people may think that, but they don't. But as a result, they may well get less people inviting them to things. So let's think tactically. How do you get someone to come and to your constituency area to look at something, to deal with something? How do you get them to take an interest in your policy? Maybe go and talk to them, because maybe, you never know, they haven't been asked yet. So there is real opportunity here.
And I think that's a very good point, Gray. I think it just underlines the importance of that political intelligence over the forthcoming sort of term, and actually getting to know what the interests of these members are, so you can really tap into that. There's so many new members, and also I would argue maybe on the reform side, there's a fair few who've come in maybe from outside who are very little understanding of Wales, and I might be starting from a low base. So the importance of that intelligence of knowing what their policy interests are and things will really pay off, and maybe able to pick them off, because you got more. I think we've all been there, flogging a dead horse trying to get members to come to one of your events or something like that. But at least there's more of them to go around, and hopefully we can capitalize on that.
Exactly. I think it always, my heart used to sink when I worked at the Senedd, and you'd get what was obviously a generic mail round to all 60 MSs saying, we'd like you to come to our insert generic event here. And actually, we know that in any walk of life, people interact with people, and so it may feel really busy and time consuming. But writing out individually via an email or whatever it might be to not all 96, but to 12 that you think have a real interest. So maybe the 12 that were cabinet members in local authorities before. I don't know if there were 12, I'm using an example. Or the 10 that used to run their own small businesses or whatever. And writing out to them with their specific experience and interests in mind is more likely for you to get a good response than just saying, I'd like to invite all 60 of you to my insert event here. So again, it's working smarter, not harder, I think.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that kind of goes back as well. It takes me back to the specialism of public affairs and knowing who's the right person and who's that contact. And just to ask if you would have a piece of advice for businesses working in Wales who want to engage, where do they start with that? And do you have any kind of general advice as a good kind of starting point for them?
My biggest piece of advice is always talk to every party. That does not mean talk to everybody, but that means talk to every party. It always frustrates me when organizations, big and small, public and private, profit and not profit, decide they're only going to speak to Welsh Government, whatever party is represented in Welsh Government. And they think we're talking to Welsh Government, and as long as Welsh Government do what we want, that's all great. Well, Welsh Government might not like everything you ask for. And then you have to have somebody else to fight your battle for you and to represent you. And we all know it's really difficult to ask somebody to help you if they don't know you. So it's too late to ask them when you need something. So you need to engage with them earlier. And so I would encourage people to look at their Reform MSs, look at their returned Conservative and Labour MSs, look at the two brand new Greens who are going to be keen and carrying forward some key policies, and look at the sole Lib Dem as well. And pick out people within this, as I've said, who are interested in your area and start to build a relationship with them. It frustrates me when organisations go to the Senedd and say, we want to meet with 35% of all MSs. Why do you want to meet with 35% of all MSs? Is it just so you can tick off a KPI? I would rather measure quality, not quantity. So get 2 and 3 champions for your cause, your organisation, your charity from each party that you can then work with and engage with over a 4-year period. I think that's much more fruitful.
Yeah, I think as well, this Senedd, and speaking to people already, it's in a much more listening mood. I think a criticism, and this may be leading into the electoral side of things, but in public affairs, I think the government, because it had been there so long, felt like it knew basically what it was doing and wasn't necessarily in much of a listening mode, whereas the new Plaid Cymru government, much more eager to hear and engage to begin with. So those backbenchers are going to want to campaign on issues within their constituencies. The new Reform MSs, this is not me being critical about them politically, but in a lot of subject areas, they don't have official policies or completely ironed out policies. So in a lot of spaces, if you're the Welsh Cockles Association, you probably can approach Reform UK and talk to them about your policy area, and they may be quite eager to listen. Mm-hmm. And same again for Conservatives, Labour. Now in the Senedd, there's a lot of soul searching and a lot of mood searching. So engage with them based on their records, based on their campaigning priorities, based on what their constituencies are like. There's lots of ways to approach it, but never ever do the generic, hi, I'm from insert organisation and please come and I'd love to talk to you about insert general campaign. It's, politicians are mostly narcissists. I don't think that's a radical statement I'm making on the podcast, but if you're going, oh, I really liked your speech, or I saw your tweet, or I saw, in your leaflet that you said this, they're suddenly going to be like, okay, that guy's actually taking the time to care. They're not just doing this because it's their job. They want to talk to me because they find that I can help them in some way. And actually always go with an ask. The amount of meetings when I was a researcher, and you'd sit down and say, oh, we just wanted to introduce ourselves. But what do you want? Like, give me an ask. Give me something to go on. So, yeah, I'd say find your champions, as Craig says, and you'll have a lot of success.
Yeah, I just think it's genuinely refreshing. I never mind what your politics are. The first quarter of a century of devolution, you kind of knew who was going to win pretty much every time. And I take on board Craig's point about the pluralistic approach, but in previous Senedd terms, and if you have got limited resources and things like that, then the natural thing would be focus on Labour, because they're always going to be the kingmakers and the ones in power. But I suppose it generally feels a bit more pluralistic now. There's a lot more, there's a lot of new members, so it just feels like a bit of a clean slate to start on, and maybe hopefully a new era for Welsh politics and the Senedd to build on.
It does feel like Labour and Conservative are in deep trouble, deep electoral trouble, and the results say that and illustrate that really plainly. I just wanted to ask about the challenges that are going to present themselves, I would say, as budgets start to be set and things like that. Do you have any predictions about who, without an overall majority, who will be approached and who will become part of that kind of cohort?
Jane Dodds, sole Lib Dem, has lost her bargaining power, being that one that got over the line. I think.
Did she use it though, Tomos? She hardly used it to good effect. Did she?
I think that strays into the political piece. But, I will let
I don't know about that. Can you explain that to me? What was that?
Well, Labour, obviously, in the last Senedd had 30 MSs, and you need 31 for a majority. So I think that's demonstrating how effective she was at getting what she wanted out of the budget.
I think if you look at Jane, she in the last budget negotiation, she secured some additional funding for local government, and she also secured a commitment to move forward with some animal welfare legislation. However, she's kind of cut that off in this campaign, because she said she will not support any funding for anything that moves towards further independence. And while Plaid are not going to be bringing forward an independence referendum in this Senedd, they have made very clear they're going to start to look at opportunities to explore how that might work in the next Senedd. So as a single member, she has quite a lot of power potentially to sway things. But equally, when she is massively opposed to Plaid Cymru's main focus over their long-term existence, I think maybe she's not in the best position from a maths perspective. So Plaid have 43 members of the Senedd, and there are 96 MSs, which means you need a majority, which is 49 to get your business done, which is 50% plus one. So they need 6 extra MSs to support them in anything they're looking to do. So there was talk before that the Greens could help them because they're aligned on independence and a number of other things. Well, if you add the 2 Greens to the 43 Plaid Cymru MSs, is that enough? No. If you chuck in a Lib Dem as well, is that enough? Still, no. The only way that they can actually get things over the line easily is to put the 43 Plaid Cymru MSs with the 9 Labour MSs, or, weirdly, the 43 Plaid Cymru with the 7 Conservative. That's obviously not necessarily going to happen, but that's the easy way of doing it. Anything outside of that requires strict negotiation and whipping on behalf of the whips. And so Heledd Vachan, who's just been appointed the chief whip for Plaid Cymru, is going to be really, really busy for the next 4 years, not only keeping her own members aligned, but also making sure that she can get deals done. And we saw already with the presiding officer vote, the math doesn't necessarily mean you need everybody to vote for you. It does mean that you can negotiate how parties might abstain on certain things. And bear in mind that Labour abstained when it came to the roll call on who the new First Minister would be. And Plaid Cymru and the Greens voted for Rhys Iorwerth. The Conservatives voted for Darren Millar. So Darren Millar got 7 votes to be First Minister. And Dan Tomos got 34 votes to be the First Minister for Reform. And so as a result, Plaid Cymru won that without a majority. So there are different ways of doing this. And I think already that's an indication of how hard it's going to be over this Senedd term. It's not as simple as just reaching out to one person or one group and saying, will you support us on this? It's going to be a lot of hard work and a lot of maths. I was chairing a a roundtable with Heledd Whatham a couple of months before the Senedd election. And she made very clear that they are, as Tomos said, open to listening to all sorts of ideas. And also they're open to working with different parties on different things where they see alignment. And so because we have a minority government, we are going to have individual negotiations taking place. And look, you never know. We might even see Plaid and the Conservatives aligning on certain things. Let's take a really obvious example. Agricultural policy, I would say they are much more aligned than the Labour Party on some agricultural policies. And so if you were to put the 43 Plaid Cymru MSs with the 7 Conservatives to get through some agricultural policy, that would work. So I think we're going to see a different way of working in this Senedd than we have previously.
And as well, I think that's right. And I think as well, what was interesting is you compare the First Minister of Scotland's rhetoric. I will meet with all party leaders except Reform, and then Marina Piorwe's comments, which was, I'm looking forward to a strong opposition. I'm looking forward to a robust debate. I'm, being very, some would even say statesmanlike in his approach to, all right, well, you're going to be the opposition, and I expect you to challenge me, but I'll still, I'll have a cup of coffee with you, and I'll, meet with you on the regular and have those conversations. And I think, again, it's a great opportunity from a public affairs standpoint, because you don't just need to bang on the door of Plaid Cymru MS. You can get, even Reform MSs who may be willing to abstain or be willing to engage, or Conservative and Labour MSs. Plaid, I think, are going to be much more willing to play the game to get its objectives through. The only place I think it's going to have its problem is with its budget, because ideologically, all parties, with the exception of Labour in terms of their mathematics, Labour would be the most hesitant to allow the Plaid Cymru government to fall over, just simply because when you look at the results of the election, 7 constituencies, the result, there's 100 votes in it, a couple of 100 votes in it, and a lot of those constituencies for the 6 seats, you're looking at no more than 2,000 votes, for a good 10-20% of the Senedd. So if government falls over and a snap election has to happen, Labour were sneaking through on 6 seats, and if the narrative is that sort of, we need a supermajority to get through our budget, which would be a Plaid Cymru narrative if their budget didn't go through, you could see even further wipeouts. So I think there's going to be a lot of pragmatism in this Senedd, because a lot of people know, particularly if they're that 5th, 6th seat, a lot of them know that if a government falls over, there is no guarantee of what that Senedd looks like at the next time around.
And I think those budget discussions will be really interesting, because obviously if Plaid want to bring in their reforms to the childcare offer and things like that, that's going to cost a lot of money. So there's going to need to be cuts elsewhere in the budget. And are those Labour members going to want to see some of their previous policies cut and things like that? But and as Craig said, I think what's really interesting for me looking ahead is whether Plaid do end up doing a deal with the Conservatives on some issues, because that would be quite seismic. I think in both parties there's a lot of people there pretty diametrically opposed to each other. It would certainly be a sign of grown-up politics, and I think it's something that we have seen in Scotland with the SNP and the Conservatives in the past. I think have voted together on some issues. So it would be quite a development if we do see legislation passed through through a Plaid Conservative alliance. And what else I think is going to be interesting is, and I take Craig's point from earlier in terms of the reform in Wales seems to be run by serious people and people who know what they're doing. But I do think keeping that party discipline across those votes is going to be a challenge over the term, and because they are disparate, and they're bringing something very different in terms of their backgrounds and their experiences and everything, and they're probably not as beholden to that old style party politics and maybe sort of loyalty and things like that. So it'd be really interesting to see if they are disciplined and vote along party lines when they should be.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, just to say, Plaid and the Conservatives And nearly the Lib Dems did form a government nearly in 2007, but we're talking ancient history there. Mixed German, but that's ancient history. Maybe that's for a different podcast.
Too much history, Thomas.
Too much history. I'm sorry, that's my major showing.
Well, let's if we look at the right now, then just very briefly, then. So we talked about different parties and negotiations. I think the big question mark is what Labour do for the next few months, because they have a temporary leader in place. Ken Skates, very experienced former minister, was tipped to be the leader of Welsh Labour when they were in government, of course, on numerous occasions. He has taken over as temporary leader following Eluned Morgan's loss at the Senedd election. I don't know how much ability he has to write new policy and negotiate on behalf of the group for long-term decision-making. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that Welsh Labour have a conference planned for November time. Now, that's probably when they're going to elect a new leader. And so that means between May and November, there's a big question mark over what the Welsh Labour group stands for, what it can do long-term deals on. But it also, again, there's an opportunity there for organisations to start having discussions about what needs to be retained from that Welsh Labour manifesto. Good policies that were brought forward over the last 5 years that need to be seen through and not ditched by Plaid Cymru. So there's real opportunities there. And I often find organisations go to politicians and say to them, you need to do this. But actually, what's really effective is going to politicians and saying, you said you were going to do this, please still do it. And do you remember your manifesto said X? I want you to do it still, please. You brought forward this policy in the during the last Senedd. Please, can you ask the new government to continue with it? So there are numerous opportunities there that don't see wholesale change that can still be used, I think.
And I think it's going to be interesting to see what Plaid Cymru is going to want from from those who want to lobby them.
Data. They've told me data.
Data. And that's interesting because it shows that they're new to obviously they're new to governing. Obviously they've had a bit of a One Wales coalition, of course, many years ago. Sorry for the history again, Louise. But the fact is that
because all three, Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, have a pro-independence sort of regimes, I think almost it gives Rhys a bit more leverage than what it normally would. And it's just going to be really interesting how the discussions go between Rhys and Keir Starmer and what he can get out of him, because it really didn't go well with Eluned, did it, and Keir, in terms of how they treated. They pretty much threw her under a bus to a certain degree. Will it mean that the Crown Estate is devolved or there's more HS2 funding? Maybe not, but it's going to be, I think, in the longer term, harder for them to keep saying no if they really want to sort of recover on a Westminster level in Wales. If they want to be showing that they're fighting for Wales, can the Labour Party really be saying that when they are just sort of flat out refusing things that were Welsh Labour policy, the devolution of policing? It's not as if the Plaid Cymru are even asking for something that the Welsh Labour Party wasn't asking for. And I think it's going to be harder for them to have this sort of blanket no. And well, let's face it, it sort of blew up in their faces ultimately, I think, and people sort of showed their dissatisfaction in the bar. I'm not saying that was the main issue, but it certainly didn't help the wider narrative.
Yeah, I think the UK government under the Labour Party, whoever is the Prime Minister at the point of this going out, I should say, is in a real catch-22 situation, though, because if they say no to a Plaid Cymru government, it looks like it's sour grapes and they're just saying no because it's not a Labour-run government. But if they say yes, what they're doing is they're giving more power to that Plaid Cymru government, and they're essentially legitimising them and saying actually they were better at negotiating than a Welsh Labour government was, which just reiterates the fact that actually at the next election, if you want decisions made and you want things done, you know who to vote for. So they're in a really difficult position here. And Rhys Iorwerth as First Minister needs to be really careful with how he uses that power, because the more often he uses it, the more tiresome it will get, and the more you can't keep repeating it, I would say. So he needs to save it for the really, really big things. And so for him, it's, do I want the devolution of benefits, which is something they have talked about before in Plaid Cymru? Do I want devolution of justice? Do I want devolution of the Crown Estate? Do I want a change in the Barnett consequential? Or do I want to try and get all of those? And there's a real question mark as to how they do that and when. And the big other change is, because we now have different governments at different ends of the M4 from a political party perspective, actually organisations need to be really careful with how they produce their messaging, because it always used to be that you could, if you wanted to engage with both governments, you come up with a message that generally works with both of them. I am a big advocate of organisations not changing their asks. You change the way that you ask them, if that makes sense. So you shouldn't change what you're looking for, but it does mean that we have to change the way that we start engaging. And so it may well be that we ask for the same thing, but we ask for it in very different ways from both Plaid Cymru government and a Westminster Labour government. And so that's something that I think organisations are going to have to pivot to much more.
And I think if Rhys is thinking about it in terms of how he wants a relationship to be, his silver bullet would be appealing to perhaps Keir Starmer's technocratic side and going, we should have a royal commission on the future of devolution. And that commission may see the arguments of devolving loads and loads of things. But as well, if a Labour government is being asked to devolve things, there are good things a government can have control of, and there are bad things governments can have control of. Insofar as, okay, I get the Crown Estate, I get this, I get that. Oh, but I also have to set income tax. Well, that's going to make me really unpopular. So there's a way, I think, that you can marry the future of powers, and it's going to be very exciting, as you alluded to. And I think actually Wales is the more volatile in terms of the nations, because with Scotland, I think the powers that be in Westminster could view it as well. It's always been distinct politically. It's always had its own, had its parliament, pre-active union, whereas Wales is an unknown. It's more closely tied to the rest of the United Kingdom with that cross-border relationship. So I think it's harder to even ignore, and also just more complex.
And I think it's so, like, from what we've discussed, I think it's just so fresh at the moment. The dust is settling. We don't know how that's going to play out. Hearing you talk as well, there's a distinct lack of kind of talking about reform and the role they all play, which leads me to assume that they won't have very much, but or that could also be because we don't know that much about them as well. So yeah, time will tell, and I'm sure by the time we air this episode, there'll be more information that's come to light again. So thank you very much for joining today. And I don't know if you wanted to make any last kind of pieces of advice for when we're listening to this next week, where predictions about what we think will happen and where we'll be.
I'm not going to make any predictions. I've learned to not do those. But in terms of milestones, I think really important things to look out for. So in the coming weeks and months, we've got a Welsh government, we've got the ministers in place. What we're now going to be seeing in the next few weeks is Senedd committees formed. What those committee makeups are like in terms of members from different parties, but different personalities, and importantly, who chairs them. And I think that's going to be interesting from a reform perspective, which new reform MSs are chairing some of those committees. That's going to be interesting. Over the summer, I can expect consultations from each of those Senedd committees coming out to look at their forward work programs. That's ultimately the committee saying to the wider public, what should we scrutinise and look at for the next 4 years? I would encourage organisations to look at those and respond in part where they want to make sure that their key asks and their key messages are got across. If nothing more, to make sure that the committees start to look at the priority things and not look at things that are incidental. And then one final sort of milestone I think is really important to flag is the programme for government will be coming out at some point. It may be coming out over the summer. It may come out in early autumn, but that's essentially like the cheat sheet from the Welsh Government. It says, this is everything that we're going to want to do for the next 4 years. It's essentially like a policy version of their manifesto stuck together. That's the official document. And so for any organisation that wants to engage with Welsh Government, to understand what they're going to do, to understand how they can help them, to understand how they can get their asks across and their messages, look at that programme for government, because that will give us a really good indication as what they want to do and how they want to do it. And I would say align your messaging and your engagement with that. And it's a really good way of starting to build that relationship with Welsh Government.